around. Yes, okay. Okay, yeah, I'd just like to give you a 15-minute breakdown on this this new project that we have, which is a financial needs assessment to determine how much we need to spend on biodiversity in Ireland to meet the needs of the objectives of the National Biodiversity Action Plan. So I'll talk for about 15 minutes and hopefully some questions afterwards. Just to give you some background there, well, a healthy ecosystem is essential to our existence on this planet, but biodiversity everywhere is under severe pressure for a multitude of factors. And moreover, what we have is a significant gap between our spending on biodiversity and what is actually needed to protect it. So this slide gives a bit of a background to the project, which is funded by the National Parks and Wildlife Service and by the IRC. In 2017 and 2018, we undertook a biodiversity expenditure review, and that was to determine how much is spent on biodiversity protection in Ireland. And the principal objective there was to identify where the money was coming from, how effective it is, and how much might need to be spent to do things properly. This year, we have funding for a follow-up project, which is namely financial needs assessment. We have that funding until the end of the year. And the objective, as I was saying, is to identify how much we need to spend to meet the objectives of the National Biodiversity Action Plan. So the first element of that has been a policy and institutional review, which has now been produced and is available online. And this brought together the evidence from the preceding biodiversity expenditure review and compared it with the institutional environment that we have in Ireland, which decides how much money is allocated and actually spent. Ultimately, we also expect to estimate what needs to be spent and feed that into a resource mobilization strategy to decide where the money is going to come from to meet our biodiversity commitments going forward. Now, as I was saying there at the beginning, there's numerous pressures on Irish biodiversity. Over 90% of our habitats are in inadequate condition, and about a third of our habitats are in actual bad status. So we're really in quite a lamentable situation as regards biodiversity. Only 53% of protected species are in favorable condition. And we have more on a declining trend at about 10% than actually are improving in their status. And that includes, for instance, many of our pollinated insect species. For instance, 7 out of 20 bumblebee species are in danger of extinction in Ireland. And it also includes birds which was very common and very familiar, birds such as the curlew, which is a wonderful species, a very evocative species with the call that it makes if you're visiting upland areas or used to visit upland areas. Other once common birds like lapwing and yellowhammer and corncrake, all obviously in severe danger of loss in Ireland. There's some of the reports there, the relevant reports of the National Biodiversity Action Plan at the bottom there. So the pressures that we have on biodiversity, well, certainly intensification of agriculture over the last 30 years, and that's brought with it a loss of a lot of farmland birds, through those species I mentioned, but also a loss of soil biodiversity and pollinators, all of which are very essential to agricultural productivity itself. Land use change, obviously urban development, but also roads, and this is contributing to a fragmentation of the habitat that we have left. We're continuing loss of peatland. Only 4% of raised bogs are actually intact, and I think only about 1% of those are actually active in the sense that they're growing and sequestrating carbon from the atmosphere. We still have this issue of commercial forestation in Ireland. Forestry policy has much improved, but we still have a situation where over half of planting is of exotic conifer species, which generally provide poor habitat for species and often replaces habitat which might be of conservation value, such as semi-natural grassland. We have degradation of our marine resource. Again, the situation here is improving. We have better controls on fish catches, but we still have this legacy of overfishing. And we still have unsustainable practices going on, such as bottom dredging for shellfish, etc. So we have various problems there. We have this problem of water pollution. The most recent EPA report shows that there's been a further fall in water quality with a reduced number of sites in good condition. Yet originally, according to legislation, water bodies were supposed to be in good status by 2015 under the Water Framework Directive, and we keep on moving this target forwards. Now it's 2021, next time it's going to be 2026. We don't really seem to be able to be successfully tackling this situation of continued water pollution. We have problems with invasive alien species, rhododendron and cherry laurel. There's a beautiful wood just up the hill from me here, which I've been making much use of during the lockdown, but it is smothered in cherry laurel, and that is of no value to biodiversity and is suppressing any regeneration of the woodland. We also have other very problematic species, particularly in the aquatic environments like Lycoscythum, God, I pronounced that right, and this dreadful plague that we have with crayfish, which is killing off the American crayfish, which is killing off the native species of crayfish. And now to top it all, we have climate change. So just when you thought things were bad, they're going to get even worse potentially. And the situation is very similar internationally. Habitat loss, invasive alien species pollution, persecution of species, population expansion, and overexploitation. It's all much the same story. So what is the importance of taking a financial perspective? Well, most attention, of course, has been given to the scientific evidence, and we do need more science, and we certainly need more in the way of monitoring of habitats. But I'd argue that we also need to consider the economic aspects too. We need to bring about behavioral change. We need to engage with different stakeholders, different government departments. We need to think about what incentives might be necessary to change behavior, particularly amongst people who have responsibility for land use. We need to ensure that our policymakers recognize the contribution that ecosystem services make to our economy and to our well-being. We need to mainstream that awareness across sectors so that all sectors have responsibility for biodiversity and for funding of biodiversity protection, because it's in their interests. We need to demonstrate the benefits of biodiversity and compare these with the costs of protection of biodiversity, which are usually small in comparison. We need to do this because we're in a situation of competing demands from funding from other areas, not least COVID-19, which is potentially going to put a brake on funding unless we fight the case for biodiversity. So essentially, we are still stuck in this situation of a neoliberal capitalist model. We just have to lump it. We have to make sure that we get the best deal for biodiversity. Now, a failure to do this to date is one reason that the amount that we spend on biodiversity is just a fraction of what we need to spend. So internationally, we spend about 30 to 52 billion US dollars per year on biodiversity, which sounds a lot, but we really need to be spending about 250 billion dollars per year to protect biodiversity. And I haven't shown it on this particular figure, but the benefits that we get from biodiversity are way in excess of those $250 billion per year. And potentially we can do it. Sorry, these are very large figures, but we're already spending about $367 billion per year on climate finance now. So the politicians, well, except the big one in the White House, have come to realize the importance of climate change, and the money is going into that. There is funding for that. A lot of that is private money. We need to make the same case for biodiversity. So the methodology that we're using in this project is taken from the UNDP BioFin model, and this is essentially an initiative taken by the UN to encourage developing countries in particular to be conscious of the value of biodiversity as a resource to their countries, and to ensure that sufficient funds, including in their case a lot of international funds, is available to protect it. So the BioFin has some very useful methodological guidelines for us, and some very useful spreadsheet templates for us to fill in to complete the biodiversity expenditure review, but also now the financial needs assessment. Now, coming back to the results of the National Biodiversity Expenditure Review, this figure gives you an idea what we're up against, because this is the amount of spending, direct spending on biodiversity by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And you can see that this has been decreasing year in, year on, every year for the period. Sorry, we were looking at the period 2010 to 2015. But the situation hasn't changed. It's stabilized a little bit, but it's pretty much that same trend. If you notice, of course, 2009 to 2011 was the period of the recession, and there was more spending on biodiversity at that time than there is now. So that gives you an indication of just how much our government ministers prioritize this whole issue of biodiversity. And some interesting findings from that biodiversity review. On average, we're spending about 250 million euros per year over the period 2010-2015 on biodiversity. That is 0.13% of GDP, which is slightly higher than that amount that is spent by Kazakhstan, for example. It's only 0.3% of total government spending, and you can get an impression of that from the hundreds of billions that they're planning to spend in the aftermath of the current pandemic. 97% of that money that we're spending on biodiversity is originating with the state, so it's essentially state money, public money. Much of that is coming in the form of EU match funding, so it's not entirely our own money as such. One very interesting finding is if you look at the top there, you can see how little is spent by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, or the Department of Cultural Heritage Geltocht, but 78% of the money that is spent on biodiversity is coming from the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and the Marine, Food and the Marine. So you can see there's a huge amount of spending, which is essentially subsidies. 80% of the spending is subsidies, and it's mainly in the form of agri-environmental policy. It's essentially additional transfers to farmers, which have the dual function of supporting farmers' incomes, but also of providing some protection for biodiversity as well. That because so much money goes on agriculture, it also means we've been allocating the money between the various National Biodiversity Action Plan targets, and also the targets of the Convention on Biological Diversity as well. For the target for the Convention on Biodiversity, that agricultural spending essentially means that 70% of our spending is on one target. There was 11 targets, I think, altogether. So if there's direct spending, it's only small in comparison. It's mainly through the National Parks and Wildlife and life projects, and only a very small fraction, 4% of that, is actual capital investment, and the rest of it is all operational expenditure. So the capital investment is really what we're doing to improve or restore a lot of our habitats, and it's only 4% of that budget. So even though agriculture still accounts for such a huge amount of expenditure, that follows the situation that we've weighted that expenditure by at only 75% of total expenditure, because accepting that agri-environmental payments also perform an income transfer to farmers as well. They're not entirely there for the protection of biodiversity. They haven't always been very good at protecting biodiversity by all accounts, but they are improving. There is much more targeting in the way of agricultural payments at the moment. We've excluded some spending, which would otherwise, which is not principally directed at biodiversity. It provides some biodiversity protection, but most of the EPA spending is not so much directed at biodiversity, but at environmental protection generally. and particularly in relation to public health. If we included that spending, which is 1.5 billion, then it would obviously skew the results enormously. The same is true of things like wastewater treatment. Obviously, treating wastewater is of benefit to water quality and is of benefit indirectly to biodiversity. We spend a huge amount on wastewater treatment, but its principal objective is to protect human health and environmental quality generally. So we've had to include these weighting coefficients to give a more accurate picture of what is really spent on biodiversity. So with the current financial needs assessment, we will have to revisit our estimates of baseline spending and identify who spends it. We have to try to identify how that spending can be more effective, where there might be synergies with other aspects such as climate change adaptation, but also things like agricultural productivity, fisheries productivity. It all depends on ecosystem services at the end of the day. We'll have to determine how much needs to be spent to meet the objectives of the National Biodiversity Action Plan. So rather different questions last time around. This time we're trying to find out what people want to spend, what they need to spend, as opposed to what they have spent, which is never a question that anybody likes to ask because they have to pass it to the accountants. Now it's a bit more proactive, I suppose, in terms of what we would like to spend. So it's a slightly easier job, I hope. We have to decide, we have to identify how that spending can be more effective, how we can progress more towards national and international targets in relation to biodiversity, and if there are better ways of spending and raising funds for biodiversity. So that's all the objectives of our current project. The first part of that project has been the policy and institutional review, which you now can get online if you wish. That it describes the drivers of biodiversity loss in Ireland, the legislation, the financial mechanisms that exist, the sometimes harmful subsidies that act against the benefit of biodiversity, opportunities to improve the capacity of institutions, and to identify new sources of funding for biodiversity. So far with that, the policy and institutional review, we've had a high dependence, we've identified the high dependence that exists on natural capital and ecosystem services in many different sectors of the economy. We can see that there are a growing suite of EU directives which are aiming to protect either environmental quality or biodiversity. But as I said, with the Water Framework Directive, the targets are often not actually met and just rolled over. We've identified a need for more mainstreaming across government departments. Opportunities for synergies. I mentioned the opportunity to couple more funding for biodiversity with climate change adaptation. We can see that the public institutions, namely the National Parks and Wildlife Service, which are involved in conservation, are chronically underfunded. And we believe that biodiversity should be a requisite consideration in all sectoral financial plans, that we should retain core government spending, but we also need to examine new markets and private sector opportunities. It's quite evident that that's very much the case in developing countries. In developed countries, by contrast, we've rather relied upon public finance to do everything. Even the NGOs that we have in Ireland, whose spending is only about sort of, I don't know, 2-3% of the total. Most of that money originates with state support rather than actually voluntary money. So finally, towards the end of the project, we'll be looking at some financial mechanisms to supplement the amounts that we spend on biodiversity. That could include payments for ecosystem services. The obvious one of those is payments to farmers to produce in a more sustainable way. But there are other opportunities, for instance, to protect peatlands, for carbon sequestration, and for storm mitigation. Payments for catchment management to ensure that the water quality is better. There are lots of opportunities to bring more ecosystem services into the economy. There's opportunities for biodiversity offsetting, whereby if a new development is approved and that development has any impact upon the natural habitat or environments, that we offset that with the creation or the protection of habitats and environments elsewhere. Easements are another opportunity thing that we could look at. There's basically tax write-offs for preserving in perpetuity areas for biodiversity. We could do much more in the way of examining the opportunity for philanthropic funds. We actually get quite a lot of such money in Ireland, but it goes usually to more social causes. Internationally, there's a lot more of that philanthropic funding which is going to the environmental causes. We're just not getting a hand on that, and that's partly because our institutions are underfunded and don't really have the opportunity to actually investigate these alternative sources of money. And that's also true for aspects such as green bonds as well. Green bonds are a huge market. Governments around the world, even private corporations, have issued green bonds. The amount of money that is raised through these green bonds is in the order of hundreds of billions of euros every year. Ireland has also issued green bonds as well, but biodiversity hasn't seen very much of the revenue from those green bonds. It's a huge opportunity for us to do much more to raise income for biodiversity. And then there's climate finance as well. This climate finance mostly at the moment directed towards developing countries, again, particularly in relation to the RED initiative to protect rainforests and peatlands in developing countries. But there's also more opportunities for us to tap into that climate finance revenue and to spend some of that money on similar environments such as peatlands and islands, which are sequestering carbon, which have the potential to sequester carbon, but which at the moment are emitting carbon to the atmosphere. There's lots of other areas in which we could be using climate finance to benefit biodiversity too. So that's it. Didn't want to keep you too long. It's a bit longer than I intended to. But yes, we would welcome any questions and